The sound of tearing paper echoed through room 204 like thunder before a storm, each rip deliberate and cruel, as Jake Mitchell held the remains of what had once been Sarah Chen's carefully prepared lesson plans high above his head. His gray eyes gleamed with malicious satisfaction as he watched the fragments flutter to the ground like broken dreams, some pieces landing in the puddle of spilled coffee that his friend Derek had accidentally knocked over moments before. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. In that instant, as 23 pairs of student eyes watched to see how the newest teacher at Riverside High would respond to this calculated humiliation, Sarah made a decision that would transform not just her classroom, but the lives of 3 young men who had gravely underestimated the quiet woman standing before them. The torn papers scattered at her feet contained more than just lesson plans about Shakespeare and Steinbeck. They held copies of her father's immigration documents, old letters from her grandmother in Taiwan, and family photos she'd planned to use in a unit about storytelling across cultures. But what Jake and his crew didn't know, what nobody at Riverside High School knew, was that beneath Sarah's modest cardigans and gentle demeanor lay 15 years of rigorous martial arts training that had earned her a 3rd-degree black belt in Taekwondo, and a reputation in competition circles that would have made her students' jaws drop. The real question wasn't whether she could handle 3 entitled teenagers who thought destruction was entertainment, but whether she would choose to reveal the warrior hidden beneath the teacher's exterior. Sarah Chen had dreamed of teaching since she was 12 years old, watching her own English teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, transform a classroom of reluctant 8th graders into passionate readers through nothing more than genuine enthusiasm and unwavering belief in their potential. 20 years later, at 32, Sarah finally stood in her own classroom at Riverside High School in suburban Denver, Colorado, arranging desks and hanging motivational posters with the same nervous excitement she'd felt before her first tournament fight. Her long black hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and she wore a navy blazer over a cream-colored blouse, projecting the professional yet approachable image she'd carefully cultivated during her student teaching semester. The classroom itself was a standard institutional rectangle with fluorescent lighting that cast everything in a slightly greenish hue, but Sarah had done her best to make it welcoming with plants on the windowsill, colorful bulletin boards featuring diverse authors, and a reading corner with comfortable chairs she'd purchased with her own money. The morning sun streamed through the windows as Sarah arranged copies of her first-week handouts, each one meticulously planned to engage students while establishing clear expectations. She'd spent the entire summer preparing for this moment, reading educational journals, attending workshops, and crafting lesson plans that would make literature come alive for teenagers who'd probably rather be anywhere else. Her teaching philosophy centered on respect, engagement, and the belief that every student had a story worth telling, principles that had served her well during her practice teaching at a middle school across town. What she hadn't anticipated was walking into a school culture that had grown toxic over years of administrative indifference and unchecked privilege. Riverside High School served one of Denver's more affluent suburbs, where many families had moved specifically for the school's reputation in academics and athletics. The building itself was impressive, barely 10 years old, with modern facilities, well-equipped classrooms, and a football stadium that rivaled some small colleges. The student parking lot was filled with cars that cost more than most teachers' annual salaries, and the hallways buzzed with conversations about ski trips to Aspen and summer homes in California. It was the kind of school where test scores were high, college acceptance rates were impressive, and parents donated generously to ensure their children had every advantage. Unfortunately, it was also the kind of place where money talked loudly enough to drown out inconvenient truths about behavior and accountability. Sarah's first hint that things might not be as perfect as they appeared came during new teacher orientation, when Principal Robert Hayes spent more time discussing the importance of maintaining relationships with influential families than he did on actual educational policies. A tall man in his 50s with graying hair and an expensive watch, Hayes had built his career on managing appearances rather than managing students. His office walls were covered with photos of himself with various community leaders, donors, and star athletes, creating a shrine to his own networking abilities rather than educational achievements. During their one-on-one meeting, he'd been pleasant enough, but had made several comments that left Sarah feeling uneasy about the school's priorities. The English department head, Margaret Stevens, had been more helpful, but had also offered some troubling insights during their coffee meeting the week before school started. A veteran teacher in her late 50s with silver hair and tired eyes, Margaret had spent 30 years in education and had the weary wisdom that came from watching idealistic young teachers get crushed by systemic problems they couldn't solve. She'd warned Sarah about certain students whose parents wielded significant influence, speaking in the careful code that experienced educators used when they couldn't say what they really meant. There were references to challenging family dynamics, students who require special handling, and situations that need to be managed delicately, all of which translated to the same basic message. Some kids could get away with behavior that would get others suspended. The faculty Sarah met seemed divided into two camps: the veterans who had learned to navigate the political landscape by keeping their heads down and avoiding conflict, and the younger teachers who still believed they could make a difference, but were slowly being worn down by a system that protected the wrong people for the wrong reasons. During lunch meetings and casual conversations, she'd heard whispered stories about students who'd faced no consequences for cheating, harassment, or even minor acts of vandalism because their parents had connections or donated money to the school. It painted a picture of an institution where justice was negotiable and influence mattered more than integrity. Despite these warning signs, Sarah remained optimistic about her ability to create a positive learning environment in her own classroom. She'd dealt with difficult students during her practice teaching and had always found ways to connect with even the most resistant learners through patience, creativity, and genuine interest in their lives and perspectives. Her own background had given her insights into feeling like an outsider. Her parents had immigrated from Taiwan when she was 3, and she'd grown up navigating between two cultures while trying to find her place in American society. Those experiences had taught her empathy for students who might be struggling with their own identity issues or family pressures. What Sarah hadn't shared with anyone at Riverside was the other significant part of her background. At age 7, she'd been enrolled in Taekwondo classes at her parents' insistence, partly for self-defense and partly as a way to build confidence and discipline. Her father, Dr. James Chen, was a quiet man who worked as a hospital radiologist, but he'd grown up hearing stories from his own father about the importance of being able to protect oneself and one's family. Her mother, Linda, was a nurse who had seen too many victims of violence come through emergency rooms and believed that martial arts training was as important as academic education for a young woman growing up in America. Sarah had initially resisted the classes, preferring books to physical activities, but her instructor, Master Kim, had been patient and encouraging, teaching her that martial arts was as much about mental discipline as physical technique. Over the years, she'd discovered that she had natural talent for the sport, with quick reflexes, excellent balance, and the kind of focused determination that separated good students from great ones. By high school, she was competing at the state level, and by college, she'd earned her black belt and was teaching younger students at Master Kim's dojo. The discipline and confidence she'd gained through martial arts had served her well in college and graduate school, giving her the mental toughness to persevere through challenging coursework, and the self-assurance to speak up in seminars where she was often the only Asian American student. After earning her master's degree in English literature with a focus on multicultural narratives, Sarah had continued training while working as a substitute teacher and preparing for her teaching career. She'd earned her second degree black belt at 27 and her third degree just last year, but she'd never mentioned her martial arts background during the hiring process at Riverside. It wasn't that she was hiding it exactly, but she'd learned that people sometimes made assumptions about martial artists that didn't align with her goals as an educator. She wanted to be known for her teaching abilities, not for her fighting skills, and she believed that the best teachers were those who resolved conflicts through communication and understanding rather than intimidation. The first week of school had gone relatively smoothly, with Sarah meeting her classes and beginning to learn her students' names and personalities. She taught 5 sections of English, ranging from freshman composition to senior literature, with class sizes that hovered around 25 students each. Most of her students seemed engaged and respectful, asking thoughtful questions and participating in discussions about the books and writing assignments she'd planned for the semester. There were the usual challenges that came with any new teaching position: learning the school's technology systems, figuring out the best routes between classrooms, and adjusting to the rhythm of 6-period days with only 1 planning period. However, Sarah had quickly identified 3 students who seemed determined to test every boundary she attempted to establish. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jake Mitchell was the most obvious problem, a senior who carried himself with the swagger of someone who'd never faced meaningful consequences for his actions. At 6 feet tall with broad shoulders from years of football, Jake had the kind of traditional all-American looks that had probably gotten him out of trouble since kindergarten. His blonde hair was always perfectly styled, his clothes were expensive without being flashy, and his smile could shift from charming to predatory depending on his audience. Jake's father owned one of the largest construction companies in the state, employing hundreds of workers and holding contracts for major municipal projects. His mother served on the school board and chaired the fundraising committee that had paid for the new gymnasium. In other words, Jake Mitchell was untouchable, and he knew it. Jake's closest friend was Derek Sullivan, a junior whose family owned a chain of successful restaurants throughout the Denver metro area. Derek was smaller than Jake, but made up for it with a quick wit and cruel sense of humor that he deployed like a weapon against anyone he perceived as vulnerable. His dark hair was usually disheveled in a way that looked casual, but probably took considerable effort to achieve, and his green eyes held an intelligence that could have served him well academically if he'd chosen to apply it constructively. Instead, Derek seemed to view school as his personal entertainment venue, with teachers and fellow students serving as unwitting performers in his ongoing comedy show. His parents were frequently out of town managing their restaurant empire, leaving Derek with minimal supervision and maximum access to his family's considerable resources. The third member of their unofficial crew was Marcus Foster, a sophomore who was desperately trying to earn acceptance from the older boys, despite being clearly out of his league. Marcus was tall and lanky, all elbows and knees, with red hair and freckles that made him look younger than his 16 years. His family wasn't as wealthy as Jake's or Derek's, but his father was a successful lawyer who specialized in defending wealthy clients against various charges, often successfully arguing that his clients deserved second chances or reduced sentences due to their potential or family circumstances. Marcus seemed to understand that his association with Jake and Derek elevated his social status, and he was willing to go along with increasingly destructive behavior in order to maintain his position in their group. From her first day, Sarah had noticed the way other students reacted when Jake's crew entered a room. Conversations would quiet slightly, and kids would glance nervously in their direction before returning to their own activities. It was the kind of subtle shift in atmosphere that indicated a pattern of behavior that had been established over time. During her classes, Jake would arrive precisely on time, but would make his entrance as disruptive as possible, dropping his backpack loudly, scraping his chair across the floor, and making comments under his breath that were just quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability, but loud enough to distract other students. Derek's favorite tactic was to ask seemingly innocent questions that were actually designed to derail lessons or put Sarah in uncomfortable positions. He had a particular talent for bringing up controversial topics, or making observations that seemed thoughtful on the surface but carried undertones that made everyone in the room slightly uncomfortable. When they read their first short story, Derek had raised his hand to ask whether Sarah had chosen authors who looked like her, because she thought students couldn't relate to regular American writers, phrasing the question in a way that sounded like genuine curiosity while carrying clear implications about her qualifications and motivations. Marcus typically followed the lead of the other two, but his attempts to impress them often resulted in more overtly disruptive behavior. He would drop things at strategic moments, make exaggerated faces when Sarah's back was turned, and laugh just a little too loudly at Jake's and Derek's comments. What made Marcus particularly frustrating was that he was actually a bright kid who showed flashes of genuine interest in the material when he wasn't performing for his friends. Sarah had seen him reading ahead in their anthology during study hall and had noticed that his initial assignments showed real insight and creativity. It was clear that his disruptive behavior was a choice rather than an inability to engage with the academic content. The escalation had been gradual but steady over the first 3 weeks of the semester. What started as minor disruptions had grown into more deliberate acts of disrespect and defiance. Jake had begun arriving to class a few minutes late each day, timing his entrance to interrupt whatever Sarah was saying and forcing her to pause while he settled in. Derek had started bringing food to class despite clear rules against eating in academic areas, making a show of unwrapping granola bars or opening chip bags during quiet moments. Marcus had taken to making sound effects under his breath, creating a constant low-level soundtrack of clicks, whistles, and throat clearing that was just subtle enough to avoid direct confrontation but persistent enough to be maddening. Sarah had tried all the standard interventions that had worked during her student teaching experience. She'd spoken to each of the boys individually after class, explaining her expectations and offering them opportunities to start fresh each day. She'd moved their seating assignments to separate them from each other and place them closer to her desk where she could monitor their behavior more closely. She'd even tried incorporating their interests into her lessons, bringing in articles about sports and business to complement their literature assignments. Nothing had worked. If anything, her attempts at accommodation seemed to embolden them, as if they viewed her flexibility as weakness rather than professionalism. The breaking point had been building for several days, starting with an incident the previous Friday that should have been a warning sign. Sarah had been distributing graded essays when Jake had loudly announced that he didn't understand why they had to read old books by dead people, when they could be learning practical skills that would help them in the real world. Derek had immediately chimed in with agreement, suggesting that Shakespeare was outdated and irrelevant to modern students. Marcus had added his own commentary about how English class was a waste of time compared to business or economics courses that would actually help them make money after graduation. Sarah had tried to turn the moment into a teachable opportunity, explaining how literature helped develop critical thinking skills, empathy, and communication abilities that were valuable in any career. She'd given examples of successful business leaders who credited their liberal arts education with giving them the analytical and creative skills they needed to solve complex problems. But her reasoned response had only seemed to amuse the three boys, who exchanged knowing looks and smirks that suggested they viewed her explanation as further evidence of her naivete about how the real world actually worked. The weekend had given Sarah time to reflect on the situation and develop a more structured approach to classroom management. She'd spent Saturday morning at her favorite coffee shop, grading papers and reviewing educational research about dealing with entitled students and systemic behavioral problems. She'd found several articles that confirmed what she was experiencing. Schools in affluent areas often struggled with students who had been taught that rules didn't apply to them, and teachers who felt unable to enforce consequences due to pressure from administrators and influential parents. Sunday had been her day for martial arts training, something she'd maintained religiously even during the busiest weeks of her new teaching schedule. Master Kim's dojo was located in a converted warehouse about 20 minutes from her apartment, and the familiar smell of worn mats and the sound of students practicing forms had immediately helped her find her center. She'd spent 2 hours working on advanced techniques, sparring with other black belts, and remembering the mental discipline that had carried her through years of competition. The physical exertion and mental focus of training always helped her think more clearly about challenges in other areas of her life. Master Kim, now in his 70s but still moving with the fluid grace that had made him a champion in his youth, had noticed Sarah's tension during their session. After class, he'd invited her to stay for tea, a ritual that often preceded his most valuable lessons. They'd sat in his small office behind the main training area, surrounded by trophies, certificates, and photos spanning 5 decades of martial arts instruction. Master Kim had a way of asking simple questions that helped his students find their own answers, and Sarah had found herself explaining the situation at school without directly asking for advice. A warrior's greatest strength, Master Kim had said after listening to her story, is knowing when not to fight. But sometimes, when all other options are exhausted, a warrior must also know when fighting becomes necessary to protect what is most important. He'd paused to sip his tea, letting the weight of his words settle. The question you must ask yourself is not whether you can handle these young men, but whether allowing them to continue their behavior serves your other students or your mission as a teacher. Sometimes we must act not out of anger, but out of responsibility to those who cannot protect themselves. Those words had stayed with Sarah throughout Sunday evening as she finalized her lesson plans for the week ahead. She'd decided to implement a more structured approach to classroom management, with clear consequences for disruptive behavior and immediate follow-through when rules were violated. She'd also prepared backup activities and alternative seating arrangements in case she needed to make changes quickly. Most importantly, she'd made peace with the possibility that she might need to escalate the situation to administration if her classroom interventions didn't work, even knowing that such escalation might not result in meaningful consequences for the students involved. Monday morning had arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that seemed to put everyone in a somber mood. Sarah had arrived at school 30 minutes early, as was her habit, using the quiet time to make final preparations and mentally rehearse her lessons for the day. Her first 3 classes had gone smoothly, with students seeming more focused than usual and several productive discussions about the short stories they'd been reading for homework. She'd begun to hope that maybe the weekend break had reset everyone's attitudes and that the new week would bring a fresh start. Her fourth period class, Advanced English 11, was where Jake, Derek, and Marcus were all enrolled. It was also her largest class, with 28 students packed into a room designed for 20, making management more challenging even under the best circumstances. The class included several high-achieving students who were genuinely interested in literature and discussion, but it also contained enough social dynamics and personality conflicts to make every day feel like a delicate balancing act. Sarah had planned a lesson around Amy Tan's Two Kinds, a story that explored themes of identity, family expectations, and cultural conflict between generations. She'd chosen it partly because it connected to her own experiences as a second-generation immigrant, but mainly because it raised universal questions about parent-child relationships and the pressure to live up to others' expectations. She'd prepared discussion questions that would help students connect the story to their own lives while analyzing Tan's use of symbolism and character development. The lesson had started well, with students offering thoughtful insights about the story's central conflicts and relating them to their own experiences with family expectations and personal goals. Sarah had been pleased to see even some of her quieter students participating in the discussion, sharing perspectives that enriched everyone's understanding of the text. For the first 20 minutes of class, she'd almost forgotten about her concerns regarding Jake's group, focusing instead on facilitating the kind of engaged literary discussion that had drawn her to teaching in the first place. Jake had arrived on time for once, but Sarah had noticed immediately that he seemed different than usual. There was an energy about him that felt more aggressive than his typical casual disrespect, and he'd been whispering intensely with Derek and Marcus before class started. During the discussion, he'd remained uncharacteristically quiet, but Sarah had caught him several times staring at her with an expression that seemed calculating rather than merely bored. Derek had also been subdued, responding to questions with uncharacteristic brevity and avoiding his usual attempts at humor. Marcus had seemed nervous, fidgeting with his pen and glancing repeatedly between his friends and Sarah as if waiting for some predetermined signal. The shift in classroom atmosphere had been gradual, but unmistakable. Other students had begun picking up on the tension radiating from Jake's corner of the room, and their own participation had become more hesitant as they sensed that something was brewing. Sarah had continued with her lesson plan, but she'd found herself unconsciously shifting her position to keep all three boys in her line of sight, while maintaining the discussion with the rest of the class. The moment that changed everything had come when Sarah was distributing copies of a supplementary reading for homework. She'd had her back turned for perhaps 30 seconds, reaching into her desk drawer to pull out the photocopied handouts, when she'd heard the unmistakable sound of liquid hitting paper. Turning around, she discovered that Derek had somehow accidentally knocked over his large coffee cup, sending the contents spreading across her desk and soaking into the stack of personal materials she'd brought to use in an upcoming lesson about family stories and cultural heritage. The coffee had destroyed more than just lesson plans. Mixed in with her teaching materials were copies of her father's naturalization certificate, photos of her grandparents in Taiwan, and handwritten letters in Chinese that her grandmother had sent when Sarah was a child. These weren't just teaching props. They were irreplaceable family documents that she'd planned to use as examples when asking students to share their own family stories and cultural artifacts. The coffee had soaked through everything, turning careful photocopies into soggy, illegible messes and staining original documents that held decades of family history. "Oh no," Derek had said with exaggerated concern. "I'm so sorry, Miss Chen. I guess I'm just clumsy today." His tone carried just enough false sincerity to maintain plausible deniability while making it clear to everyone in the room that the spill had been intentional. Jake had immediately added his own apology, standing up as if to help clean the mess while actually positioning himself closer to Sarah's desk, where the rest of her materials were spread out. Sarah had felt her chest tighten as she watched coffee spreading across documents that couldn't be replaced. But she'd forced herself to remain calm and speak in the measured tone she'd perfected during years of martial arts training. "It's all right, Derek. Accidents happen. Let's get this cleaned up." She'd reached for the paper towels she kept in her desk drawer, moving quickly to try to save what she could of the soaked papers. That was when Jake had made his fatal miscalculation. While Sarah was focused on trying to salvage her family documents, he'd grabbed the lesson plan she'd prepared for the rest of the week from the other side of her desk. "Oops," he'd said loudly, holding the papers high above his head where Sarah couldn't reach them. "Looks like these got mixed up in the mess." "Mr. Mitchell," Sarah had said firmly, standing up and extending her hand, "please give me those papers." Her voice had carried a note of authority that was new to her students, something harder and more commanding than her usual gentle classroom tone. "What papers?" Jake had asked with mock innocence, even as he'd begun tearing the first sheet in half. "I don't see any papers." "Do you see any papers, Derek?" Derek had grinned widely, clearly delighted by the escalation. "Nope, no papers here. Maybe Miss Chen is seeing things." That was when Jake had begun ripping the lesson plan systematically, tearing each page into smaller and smaller pieces while maintaining eye contact with Sarah. The sound of tearing paper had filled the classroom like thunder, and every student had gone completely silent, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something that would have lasting consequences. Marcus had joined in, grabbing his own papers from his backpack and tearing them up as well, throwing the pieces into the air like confetti. "Oops," he'd laughed. "I guess I'm clumsy too." Sarah had stood frozen for a moment, watching the fragments of her carefully prepared lessons flutter to the ground, where they mixed with the coffee-stained remains of her family documents. In that instant, as 25 pairs of student eyes watched to see how she would respond to this calculated destruction, Sarah had felt something shift inside her. The careful composure she'd maintained for 3 weeks, the professional patience she'd shown in the face of escalating disrespect, the benefit of the doubt she'd given to 3 young men who had clearly never learned the meaning of consequences. All of it had crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. The quiet English teacher who had spent 3 weeks being tested, pushed, and humiliated by students who thought her kindness was weakness, was about to teach Jake Mitchell, Derek Sullivan, and Marcus Foster a lesson they would never forget. But it wouldn't be a lesson about literature, or writing, or cultural understanding. It would be a lesson about respect, consequences, and the dangerous mistake of assuming that someone's choice to be gentle means they don't know how to be anything else. As the last pieces of torn paper settled on the classroom floor like snow after a storm, Sarah had looked at each of the 3 boys in turn, her dark eyes holding an intensity that none of them had seen before. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The way she held her shoulders, the steadiness of her breathing, the sudden stillness that seemed to radiate from her like calm before lightning strikes. "Gentlemen," she had said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the silent classroom, "I believe you've just volunteered for a very different kind of education." The silence that followed Sarah's words stretched across the classroom like a taut wire, broken only by the soft rustle of torn paper settling and the distant hum of the ventilation system. Jake Mitchell stood with his hands still raised from his final theatrical tear, pieces of lesson plans scattered around his feet like evidence of his destruction. His confident smirk had frozen on his face as something in Sarah's tone registered in his brain, though he couldn't quite process what had changed. Derek Sullivan had stopped mid-laugh, his mouth hanging open as he stared at their usually soft-spoken teacher with confusion and the first stirrings of unease. Marcus Foster, still holding fragments of paper in his trembling hands, looked between his friends and Sarah with growing panic, finally beginning to understand that they had crossed a line that perhaps shouldn't have been crossed. Sarah moved with deliberate calm to the classroom door, her footsteps measured and precise against the linoleum floor. Every student watched her progression with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for natural disasters or car accidents, sensing that something momentous was about to unfold but unable to predict exactly what form it would take. When she reached the door, Sarah turned the lock with a quiet click that seemed to echo through the room like a gunshot. The simple action transformed the atmosphere completely, shifting the dynamic from a typical classroom disruption to something far more serious and contained. "Miss Chen," Jake said, his voice carrying less confidence than usual, "you can't lock us in here. That's against fire regulations or something." He attempted his usual charming smile, the one that had gotten him out of countless situations throughout his academic career, but it felt forced and uncertain on his face. The easy arrogance that typically carried him through confrontations was beginning to crack under the weight of Sarah's unwavering stare, and the sudden realization that this situation was unlike any he had experienced before. Sarah didn't respond to Jake's comment about fire regulations. Instead, she walked slowly back toward the front of the classroom, her movements controlled and purposeful in a way that made several students unconsciously lean back in their seats. The transformation in her demeanor was subtle but unmistakable to anyone paying attention. The slight hunch to her shoulders that had made her appear smaller and less threatening was gone, replaced by perfect posture that seemed to add inches to her height. Her hands, which usually gestured gently when she spoke, now hung relaxed at her sides with a stillness that suggested coiled energy rather than passivity. "Mr. Mitchell," Sarah said quietly, stopping about 6 feet away from where Jake stood among the scattered papers. "You mentioned education. I think it's time you received one." Her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, but every word carried clearly through the silent classroom. There was something in her tone that made Jake's bravado falter, a quality he had never heard from any teacher before. It wasn't anger, exactly, or even disappointment. It was something far more dangerous, complete calm in the face of deliberate provocation. Derek, sensing that his friend might be losing control of the situation, stepped forward with his characteristic smirk intact. "Come on, Miss Chen, we were just having a little fun. No need to get all dramatic about some papers. I'm sure the school has a photocopier you can use." His attempt at dismissive humor fell flat in the charged atmosphere, and even he seemed to realize that his usual tactics weren't having their intended effect. The easy dismissal that had worked so well in the past felt hollow and inadequate against Sarah's quiet intensity. "Fun," Sarah repeated, as if tasting the word and finding it bitter. She looked down at the coffee-stained remains of her family documents, some of which were still soaking up the spreading liquid and becoming more illegible by the moment. "You find the destruction of irreplaceable family documents fun, Mr. Sullivan?" Her question hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time since she had started teaching at Riverside High, Derek seemed genuinely uncomfortable under her gaze. Marcus, still clutching the torn papers in his hands, made a weak attempt to defend their actions. "We didn't know they were important. They just looked like regular teacher stuff." His voice cracked slightly on the words, betraying his youth and his growing awareness that they had miscalculated badly. The confident teenager who had been performing for his older friends just minutes before was rapidly being replaced by a scared 16-year-old who was beginning to understand that actions might actually have consequences. Sarah's laugh was soft and completely without humor. "Regular teacher stuff," she said, reaching down to pick up one of the coffee-soaked photographs. The image showed her grandmother as a young woman in Taiwan, standing proudly in front of the school where she had taught before the family immigrated to America. The coffee had blurred the edges and stained the paper brown, but her grandmother's dignified expression was still visible through the damage. "This regular teacher stuff, Mr. Foster, is a photograph of my grandmother who taught children in Taiwan for 40 years before she came to this country with nothing but her dreams and her determination to give her family a better life." She held up another damaged document, water dripping from its edges onto the floor. "This regular teacher stuff is a copy of my father's medical school transcripts, which he earned while working 3 jobs and sending money back to support his parents. He studied 18 hours a day for 7 years to become a doctor, and these transcripts represent every sacrifice he made for his education and his family." Her voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath the quiet words that made even the students who weren't involved in the destruction shift uncomfortably in their seats. Jake, realizing that the situation was spiraling beyond his control, attempted to reassert his dominance through aggression. "Look, lady, I don't care about your family history lesson. You're just a teacher, and you work for us. Our parents pay your salary through their taxes, so maybe you should remember who's really in charge here." He took a step closer to Sarah, using his height and athletic build to try to intimidate her physically. It was a tactic that had worked countless times before with other teachers, coaches, and authority figures who had learned that confronting Jake Mitchell meant confronting his father's money and influence. The moment Jake stepped forward with clear, intimidating intent, something shifted in Sarah's posture that was so subtle, most students missed it entirely. Her weight settled slightly onto the balls of her feet. Her hands moved almost imperceptibly away from her sides, and her breathing became even more controlled and measured. To an untrained observer, she appeared exactly the same, but anyone with martial arts experience would have recognized the signs of someone preparing for combat. Master Kim had taught her that the greatest fighters were those who could shift from complete relaxation to full readiness in an instant, and 15 years of training had made that transition as natural as breathing. "Mr. Mitchell," Sarah said, her voice still quiet, but now carrying an undertone that made several students in the front row lean away from the confrontation. You seem to be under the impression that your father's money makes you untouchable. You believe that your last name gives you the right to destroy other people's property, disrespect their family history, and intimidate anyone who dares to hold you accountable for your actions. She paused, letting her words sink in. I'm curious to see how well that protection works when you're face-to-face with someone who doesn't care about your father's construction contracts or your mother's position on the school board. Derek, sensing that Jake was losing ground in what should have been an easy confrontation with a small female teacher, decided to escalate the situation himself. You're insane if you think you can threaten us. One phone call from any of our parents and you'll be fired before lunch. They'll make sure you never teach anywhere again. He moved to flank Sarah, positioning himself so that she would have to divide her attention between him and Jake. It was a basic intimidation tactic that had worked well against other teachers who found themselves outnumbered by aggressive students. Marcus, encouraged by his friend's apparent confidence, threw the remaining paper fragments at Sarah's feet. Yeah, maybe you should worry more about keeping your job and less about some stupid old papers. Nobody cares about your grandmother or your dad or whatever sob story you're trying to tell us. His attempt at cruelty rang hollow, delivered with the uncertainty of someone who was trying desperately to prove he belonged with the older, more confident bullies. Sarah looked down at the fresh scatter of torn papers around her feet, then back up at the three young men who had arranged themselves in what they clearly thought was a threatening formation. For a moment she was quiet, and in that silence, the other students in the classroom held their breath, sensing that they were about to witness something unprecedented in their academic experience. When Sarah finally spoke, her words were measured and deliberate, each one chosen with the precision of someone who understood exactly what she was about to do. Gentlemen, she said, I want you to understand something very clearly. For the past 3 weeks, I have chosen to respond to your harassment, your disrespect, and your deliberate attempts to undermine my classroom with patience and professionalism. I have given you multiple opportunities to modify your behavior, offered you extra help, adjusted my teaching methods to accommodate your apparent needs, and documented every incident according to proper protocols. I have done everything that a responsible educator is supposed to do when faced with challenging students. She took a step forward, and something in her movement made Jake instinctively step back, though he tried to cover the retreat by pretending to adjust his position. What you have interpreted as weakness was actually restraint. What you have seen as an invitation to escalate your behavior was actually me giving you every possible chance to demonstrate that you are capable of growth and change. What you have mistaken for fear was actually me hoping that you might eventually choose to become better than your worst impulses. Derek opened his mouth to respond with what was undoubtedly going to be another dismissive comment, but Sarah continued speaking without pause. Today, when you destroyed irreplaceable documents that represent my family's history and sacrifices, you crossed a line that I cannot and will not tolerate. When you attempted to intimidate me physically because you believed your parents' money made you untouchable, you demonstrated that you have learned nothing from our previous interactions and that you have no intention of changing your behavior. She stopped moving and stood perfectly still. Her hands relaxed at her sides, but her eyes locked on each of the 3 boys in turn. So now we're going to have a different kind of lesson. Not about literature or writing or cultural understanding, but about consequences. About respect. About what happens when entitled children finally encounter someone who cannot be bought, threatened, or intimidated into submission. The classroom had become so quiet that the sound of the clock ticking on the wall seemed abnormally loud. Students who had been recording the confrontation with their phones continued filming, but many had lowered their devices slightly, unconsciously understanding that they were about to witness something that would be discussed and analyzed for years to come. The usual rustle of papers, whispered conversations, and shifting in seats had completely stopped, replaced by the kind of absolute attention that typically only occurred during fire drills or emergency announcements. Jake, realizing that his usual tactics weren't having their intended effect, decided to escalate the physical intimidation. He was 6 feet tall and weighed over 200 pounds, most of it muscle from years of football training. He had used his size to intimidate smaller students and even some teachers throughout his high school career, and he couldn't imagine that a woman who barely came up to his shoulder could pose any real threat to him. "You know what, Miss Chen," he said, deliberately mispronouncing her name with a sneer. "I think you need to remember your place. Maybe somebody needs to teach you some respect." He reached out with the clear intention of grabbing Sarah's shoulder, a move designed to assert physical dominance while maintaining enough plausible deniability to claim later that he had only been trying to get her attention. It was the kind of aggressive gesture that had cowed other teachers into backing down, the physical equivalent of marking territory. Jake's hand moved towards Sarah's shoulder with the confidence of someone who had never faced real resistance to his bullying tactics. What happened next would be replayed in slow motion on dozens of cell phone videos and analyzed frame by students, teachers, and eventually law enforcement officials. As Jake's hand approached her shoulder, Sarah moved with a speed and precision that seemed to defy physics. Her left hand shot up to intercept Jake's wrist while her right hand grasped his elbow, and in one fluid motion that took less than a second, she had redirected his forward momentum and sent him stumbling past her toward the front of the classroom. Jake, completely off balance and moving faster than he had intended, crashed into Sarah's desk with enough force to send papers flying and knock over her coffee mug. The sound of impact was loud enough to make several students gasp, and Jake found himself bent over the desk with his arm twisted behind his back in a position that was uncomfortable, but not quite painful. Sarah had moved so quickly and efficiently that most observers weren't even sure exactly what they had seen, only that Jake had somehow gone from standing confidently to being sprawled across the teacher's desk in the space of a heartbeat. "Mr. Mitchell," Sarah said calmly, maintaining just enough pressure on Jake's twisted arm to keep him in position without causing injury. "I want you to think very carefully about your next move. You just committed assault by attempting to grab me without permission. Everything that happens from this point forward is self-defense on my part, and has been witnessed by 25 other people, most of whom are recording this interaction." Derek, shocked by the sudden reversal of what should have been an easy intimidation scenario, shouted, "Let him go! You can't do this. We'll sue you for assault." But even as he spoke, he was backing away from Sarah, his earlier confidence evaporating as he tried to process what he had just witnessed. The small woman, who had seemed so helpless just moments before, had just effortlessly neutralized his much larger friend, and Derek was beginning to realize that they had seriously miscalculated the situation. Marcus, panicking completely, rushed toward the classroom door in an attempt to escape what was rapidly becoming a nightmare scenario. But he had forgotten that Sarah had locked the door, and his desperate pulling on the handle only resulted in the rattling of metal against metal. "It's locked!" he shouted unnecessarily, his voice cracking with fear. "She locked us in here! This is kidnapping or something!" Sarah maintained her position controlling Jake's arm while speaking to the rest of the class in the same calm tone she had used to discuss literature assignments. "I want everyone except Mr. Mitchell, Mr. Sullivan, and Mr. Foster to move to the back corner of the classroom, away from the windows. Please take your backpacks and phones with you and continue recording everything that happens. This documentation will be important for the investigation that will follow." The other students moved quickly and quietly to comply with Sarah's instructions, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something extraordinary and potentially dangerous. Several of them were typing rapidly on their phones, sending messages to friends and family about what was happening in room 204. The word was already beginning to spread through the school's social media networks that something unprecedented was occurring in Miss Chen's English class. Jake struggled against Sarah's grip, trying to use his superior size and strength to break free from her control. "Let me go, you psycho!" he shouted, his voice strained with effort and embarrassment. "My father will destroy you for this. You have no idea who you're messing with." But despite his size advantage, he found that Sarah's positioning and leverage made it impossible for him to gain any mechanical advantage. Every time he tried to push himself up from the desk, she simply adjusted her grip slightly and maintained complete control of his movement. "Your father," Sarah said conversationally, "is Richard Mitchell, owner of Mitchell Construction and Development. Your mother is Catherine Mitchell, member of the school board and chair of the fundraising committee. Your family has donated approximately $150,000 to this school over the past 4 years, and your father's company was awarded the contract for the new gymnasium renovation without a competitive bidding process." Her recitation of facts was delivered in the same tone she might use to discuss homework assignments, but the implications were clear to everyone listening. Derek, realizing that Sarah somehow knew more about their families than they had expected, tried a different approach. "Look, maybe we all just got carried away. Why don't you let Jake up, and we can pretend this whole thing never happened. No harm, no foul, right?" His attempt at negotiation was undermined by the tremor in his voice and his continued backing toward the windows as he spoke. "No harm," Sarah repeated thoughtfully, glancing down at the destroyed family documents that were still absorbing coffee and becoming more damaged by the moment. "Mr. Sullivan, would you consider it no harm if someone destroyed photographs of your deceased grandparents? If they ruined documents that represented your family's immigration to this country and your parents' struggle to build a life here? If they deliberately targeted the most meaningful possessions you had brought to share with your students?" She adjusted her grip on Jake's arm slightly, causing him to grunt with discomfort. "The harm, Mr. Sullivan, is not just to the physical objects you destroyed. The harm is to the trust that should exist between teachers and students, to the learning environment that I have tried to create in this classroom, and to the basic human dignity that you have been systematically attacking for 3 weeks. The harm is to every other student in this class who has watched you get away with increasingly aggressive behavior and learned that bullying is acceptable as long as you have enough money and influence to avoid consequences." Marcus had given up his futile attempts to open the locked door and was now pressed against it, hyperventilating slightly as he stared at his friend bent over the teacher's desk. "This is insane," he whispered, though his voice carried clearly through the silent classroom. "Teachers can't do this. There are rules and laws and stuff. She can't just attack students." Sarah turned her attention to Marcus without releasing her hold on Jake. "Mr. Foster, you're absolutely right that there are rules and laws. The rule you seem to have forgotten is that students cannot destroy school property, cannot assault teachers, and cannot create hostile learning environments for their classmates. The law you've apparently overlooked is that teachers have the right to defend themselves when physically threatened by students." She nodded toward the phones that were still recording the encounter. "Everything that has happened here today has been witnessed and documented. Mr. Mitchell attempted to grab me without permission after making verbal threats. I responded with minimal force to control the situation and prevent further escalation. This is textbook self-defense, and any law enforcement official or school administrator who reviews the evidence will reach the same conclusion." Jake made another attempt to break free, this time trying to twist his body to face Sarah and potentially strike her with his free hand. But Sarah anticipated the movement and smoothly transitioned to a different control position, maintaining complete dominance of the situation while using no more force than necessary to keep Jake safely restrained. Her movements were so fluid and precise that it was clear to everyone watching that she had extensive training in exactly this type of physical control. "How are you doing this?" Derek asked, his earlier bravado completely gone. "You're like half his size. This doesn't make sense." The confusion in his voice was genuine. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for the sight of a small female teacher effortlessly controlling a much larger male student who was desperately trying to escape her grip. For the first time since the confrontation had begun, Sarah smiled slightly. "Mr. Sullivan, that's an excellent question. The answer is 15 years of martial arts training, including 8 years of competitive Taekwondo and 7 years as an assistant instructor. I have a 3rd-degree black belt and have trained with some of the best fighters in the country. I have competed at the national level and have taught self-defense classes to other women who needed to learn how to protect themselves from men who thought their size gave them the right to intimidate and assault others." The revelation sent a ripple of whispered comments through the students gathered in the back corner of the classroom. Several of them were frantically typing on their phones, sharing this new information with friends throughout the school. The idea that their quiet English teacher was actually a highly trained martial artist was so far outside their expectations that many of them were still struggling to process what they were seeing. Jake, hearing Sarah's explanation of her background, made one final desperate attempt to escape by throwing his full weight backward in an effort to knock her off balance. But Sarah simply shifted her position slightly and used his own momentum against him, guiding his movement so that he ended up face down on the floor next to her desk instead of breaking free. The transition was so smooth and controlled that it looked almost choreographed, and Jake found himself in an even more vulnerable position than before. "Mr. Mitchell," Sarah said, now kneeling beside Jake with her knee positioned to maintain control while her hands kept his arm in a submission hold. I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. You have spent the last 3 weeks testing my boundaries, escalating your harassment, and assuming that your family's money and influence made you untouchable. Today you crossed the line from harassment to assault, and you discovered that there are still people in this world who cannot be bought, threatened, or intimidated into submission. She looked up at Derek and Marcus, who were both staring at the scene with expressions of shock and disbelief. This applies to all three of you. You have been living in a bubble where your actions have no real consequences, where other people's feelings and property don't matter, and where respect is something you demand rather than something you earn. That bubble has just popped. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside the classroom made everyone freeze. Someone was approaching the door, and the measured pace suggested it was likely a teacher or administrator rather than a student. Sarah maintained her position, controlling Jake while listening to determine who might be trying to enter her locked classroom. The footsteps stopped outside the door, followed by the sound of knocking. "Miss Chen?" came the voice of Vice Principal Thompson through the door. "Is everything all right in there? We've received some concerning messages from students about a situation in your classroom." Thompson's tone was cautious but authoritative, suggesting that he was aware something unusual was happening, but wasn't sure of the exact nature of the problem. Sarah looked around the classroom, taking in the scattered papers, the spilled coffee, the damaged family documents, and the 3 young men who had learned a very hard lesson about consequences and respect. She made a decision that would determine how the rest of this situation would unfold and what kind of precedent would be set for future interactions between entitled students and the teachers who were supposed to educate them. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah called out clearly, "please call security and have them bring a set of handcuffs. I have successfully detained a student who assaulted me and destroyed school property. I will need to file police reports for assault and destruction of property, and I will need these 3 students removed from my classroom permanently." Her voice carried the same calm authority she had maintained throughout the confrontation, making it clear that she was completely in control of the situation and confident in her actions. The silence that followed her words was deafening. Through the door, they could hear Vice Principal Thompson speaking rapidly on his radio, calling for security backup and notifying the main office of the situation. In the classroom, Jake had stopped struggling and was lying motionless on the floor, finally understanding that his actions had led to consequences that his father's money and influence might not be able to fix. Derek and Marcus stood frozen against the wall, staring at their friend on the floor and beginning to comprehend that their lives had just changed dramatically. Sarah maintained her position and her calm demeanor, but inside she felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction in finally standing up to behavior that should never have been tolerated, relief that the systematic harassment would finally end, and a deep sadness that the situation had escalated to this point. She had become a teacher because she believed in the power of education to transform lives and help young people become their best selves. Today had proven that sometimes education required lessons that couldn't be found in any textbook, and that the most important teaching moments often occurred when educators were forced to set boundaries and enforce consequences that students had never experienced before. The sound of multiple sets of footsteps in the hallway indicated that security and additional administrators were arriving to deal with the situation. Within minutes, Sarah would need to explain her actions to people who might or might not understand the full context of what had led to this confrontation. She would need to justify her use of physical force against a student, document the weeks of harassment that had preceded today's incident, and face the possibility that parents with money and influence would try to turn her from victim to villain in this story. But as she looked around her classroom at the other students who had witnessed everything, Sarah saw something in their faces that gave her hope. Instead of fear or disapproval, she saw respect and admiration. She saw students who had spent weeks watching her be harassed and humiliated, who had probably assumed she was weak or incapable of standing up for herself, now understanding that her patience had been a choice rather than a limitation. She saw young people who had learned a valuable lesson about the difference between strength and aggression, between confidence and arrogance, between choosing to be gentle and being unable to be anything else. The door handle rattled as someone attempted to open it from the outside, followed by Vice Principal Thompson's voice requesting that Sarah unlock the door immediately. She looked down at Jake, who was still lying motionless on the floor, then at Derek and Marcus, who were both pale and shaken by what they had witnessed. In a few moments, This classroom would be filled with administrators, security officers, and probably police investigators. The quiet confrontation between a teacher and 3 disruptive students would become an official incident with reports, investigations, and consequences that would ripple through the school and the community for months to come. Sarah Chen had started this day hoping to teach her students about literature and cultural understanding. Instead, she had ended up teaching them about respect, consequences, and the dangerous mistake of assuming that someone's choice to be gentle means they don't know how to be strong. As she prepared to unlock the door and face whatever came next, she touched the spot where her grandmother's letters had been destroyed and silently promised that she would never again allow anyone to destroy something precious while she stood by and watched helplessly. The real education was just beginning. The lock clicked open with a sharp metallic sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence of room 204. Vice Principal Thompson stepped through the doorway first, his usually composed expression shifting to one of complete bewilderment as he took in the scene before him. Behind him followed Officer Martinez from the school's security team, a former Denver police officer, whose hand instinctively moved toward his radio as he assessed the situation. Principal Hayes arrived moments later, his expensive suit slightly rumpled from having rushed down from his office, his face already showing the kind of panic that came from knowing this incident would require phone calls to very important parents. Sarah remained in her controlled position beside Jake, who was still lying face down on the floor with his arm secured behind his back. Her breathing was calm and steady, her expression composed, and her voice carried no trace of stress or uncertainty when she addressed the administrators who had just entered her classroom. "Mr. Thompson, thank you for responding so quickly. As I mentioned, I have detained a student who physically assaulted me after destroying irreplaceable personal property. I will need to file formal charges for both assault and destruction of property." Officer Martinez, his training kicking in despite the unusual circumstances of a teacher restraining a student, approached the situation with professional caution. "Ma'am, I need you to release the student immediately so we can assess the situation properly. Whatever happened here needs to be sorted out through proper channels, not physical restraint." His tone was firm but not hostile, recognizing that Sarah appeared calm and in control rather than emotionally compromised or dangerous. "Of course," Sarah replied smoothly, releasing Jake's arm and standing up with fluid grace. "Mr. Mitchell, you may sit up slowly. Keep your hands visible and make no sudden movements." Jake pushed himself up from the floor, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger, his designer clothes wrinkled and his perfectly styled hair disheveled. The confident teenager who had entered the classroom ready to humiliate his teacher was gone, replaced by someone who had just experienced his first real taste of consequences. Principal Hayes's eyes swept across the classroom, taking in the scattered papers, the spilled coffee, and the coffee-stained documents spread across Sarah's desk. His expression grew increasingly grim as he began to calculate the potential damage this incident could cause to his carefully maintained relationships with influential families. "Miss Chen," he said tightly, "I need you to explain exactly what happened here and why you felt it was necessary to physically restrain a student." Before Sarah could respond, Derek Sullivan stepped forward from where he had been pressed against the wall. "She attacked Jake for no reason. We were just in class and she went crazy and grabbed him. She locked us in here and wouldn't let us leave." His voice was high-pitched with stress and indignation, though the tremor underneath suggested he wasn't entirely confident in his version of events. Marcus Foster nodded eagerly, desperate to support his friend's narrative. "Yeah, she just snapped. We didn't do anything wrong. She started yelling at us about some stupid papers, and then she attacked Jake when he tried to calm her down." His account was delivered with the kind of rehearsed innocence that suggested he had been practicing his story while Sarah maintained control of the situation. Officer Martinez looked between the 3 students and Sarah, his experienced eye noting the contrast between their obvious agitation and her continued calm. "Ma'am, these students are claiming you assaulted them without provocation. Do you have a different version of events?" His question was professional and neutral, but Sarah could detect the skepticism in his voice as he evaluated the believability of the students' claims. Sarah gestured toward the students gathered in the back corner of the classroom, many of whom were still holding their phones and recording the aftermath of the confrontation. "Officer Martinez, I believe you'll find that approximately 25 witnesses have documented the entire incident on their phones. I encourage you to review their recordings before accepting any verbal accounts of what transpired here today. Emma Rodriguez, one of Sarah's most conscientious students, stepped forward from the group with her phone in hand. Officer, we recorded everything. Jake and his friends destroyed Miss Chen's family photos and documents first, then Jake tried to grab her when she told them to stop. She only defended herself after he put his hands on her. Several other students murmured agreement and held up their own phones, indicating they had similar footage of the encounter. Thompson's expression shifted as he realized the implications of having multiple video recordings of whatever had occurred. In an era where every incident could become viral within hours, documented evidence would be crucial for managing both the immediate situation and any potential fallout. Students, I need all of you to save those recordings and prepare to provide copies to the administration for our investigation. No one should delete anything or post anything on social media until we've had a chance to review all the evidence. Jake, realizing that his initial strategy of denial wasn't going to work with video evidence available, shifted to a different approach. Look, maybe things got a little heated, but she's a teacher. She's supposed to be the adult here. She can't just attack students because she gets upset about some old papers. His attempt to position himself as the victim was undermined by the defensive tone in his voice, and his continued reluctance to meet anyone's eyes directly. Principal Hayes seized on Jake's admission that, quote, things got heated, as confirmation of his worst fears about the situation. Miss Chen, regardless of what these students may have done, you cannot physically restrain students. There are proper procedures for dealing with disruptive behavior, and none of them involve martial arts techniques. His words carried the tone of someone who was already preparing to throw Sarah under the bus to protect his relationships with powerful parents. Principal Hayes, Sarah said evenly, I used reasonable force to defend myself after Mr. Mitchell physically assaulted me. The video evidence will clearly show that I did not initiate physical contact and used only the minimum force necessary to control a student who was attempting to intimidate and potentially harm me. She paused, letting her words sink in. I'm curious whether you would expect a male teacher to simply allow himself to be assaulted by students, or if your concerns about proper procedures only apply when female teachers defend themselves. The pointed nature of Sarah's question created an uncomfortable silence as everyone in the room processed the implications of what she had said. Officer Martinez, who had been taking notes throughout the exchange, looked up with increased interest. Ma'am, you mentioned martial arts techniques. Do you have training in self-defense or combat sports? His question was professional, but Sarah could detect a note of respect in his voice as he began to understand that this situation might be more complex than it initially appeared. I have a third-degree black belt in Taekwondo and 15 years of competitive experience, Sarah replied matter-of-factly. I've taught self-defense classes and have extensive training in using minimal force to control aggressive individuals without causing permanent injury. My response to Mr. Mitchell's assault was textbook self-defense, designed to neutralize the threat while minimizing harm to all parties involved. The revelation sent a ripple of whispered comments through the classroom and caused Principal Hayes to pale visibly as he began to comprehend the potential legal and public relations nightmare he was facing. A trained martial artist defending herself against student assault was a very different story from a teacher losing control and attacking students, and the distinction would matter enormously in any investigation or media coverage that followed. Derek, sensing that their position was becoming increasingly untenable, made a desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative. She's trying to make it sound like we're criminals or something. We're just kids. She's the adult with all this combat training, and she used it against students. That's like bringing a gun to a knife fight or something. His metaphor was poorly chosen and only served to highlight the fact that he was now admitting to being in a fight with his teacher. Officer Martinez's radio crackled to life with a message from the main office indicating that additional security personnel were standing by and that the school district's legal team had been notified of the situation. The incident was rapidly escalating beyond a simple classroom disruption into something that would require careful handling by multiple departments and potentially external law enforcement agencies. Mr. Mitchell, Officer Martinez said, turning his attention to Jake, I need you to tell me exactly what you did immediately before Miss Chen physically restrained you. And I want you to understand that we have multiple video recordings of this incident, so I strongly advise you to be completely truthful in your account. Jake's confident facade cracked further as he realized that his usual ability to charm his way out of trouble wasn't going to work in this situation. I don't know, I might have reached toward her or something. I was just trying to get her attention because she was being crazy about some stupid papers. I didn't mean to assault her or whatever she's claiming. His admission that he had reached toward her was delivered reluctantly, and his dismissive reference to stupid papers only reinforced Sarah's account of his attitude toward her destroyed property. Sarah walked over to her desk and carefully gathered the coffee-stained documents, holding them up for everyone to see. These stupid papers, Mr. Mitchell, include photographs of my grandmother who died last year, copies of my father's immigration documents, and handwritten letters from family members in Taiwan. They are irreplaceable artifacts of my family's history that I plan to use in a lesson about cultural heritage and storytelling traditions. Her voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath as she continued. You and your friends deliberately destroyed them after spilling coffee on my desk, then threatened me when I asked you to stop. Principal Hayes, desperate to find a way to minimize the damage to his relationships with influential families, attempted to focus on what he saw as the real problem. Miss Chen, I understand that you're upset about your personal items, but the fact remains that you used excessive force against a student. We simply cannot tolerate teachers using martial arts techniques in the classroom, regardless of the provocation. His words revealed his priorities clearly. Protecting the students whose parents donated money to the school was more important than supporting a teacher who had been assaulted. Emma Rodriguez, who had been listening to the exchange with growing indignation, stepped forward again with her phone held high. Mr. Hayes, do you want to see the video of Jake threatening Miss Chen and grabbing her shoulder? Because I have it right here, and so do like 10 other people. She didn't use excessive force. She stopped him from assaulting her. If this was happening to your daughter, would you want her to just stand there and let some entitled brat put his hands on her? The student's passionate defense of Sarah and her pointed question about Hayes' own daughter created another uncomfortable moment of silence. Other students began murmuring agreement and holding up their own phones, making it clear that they had witnessed the encounter and supported Sarah's version of events. The tide of opinion in the room was clearly flowing against Jake and his friends, despite their parents' influence and status. Officer Martinez, recognizing that the situation required immediate de-escalation and proper documentation, made a decision that would determine how the incident would be officially recorded. I'm going to need to review all available video evidence before making any determinations about charges or violations. Mr. Mitchell, based on your own admission that you made physical contact with Miss Chen and Miss Chen's account that she was defending herself, I'm treating this as a potential assault case that will require full investigation. Jake's face went white as the implications of Officer Martinez's words sank in. Wait, you can't arrest me. I'm 17 years old. I have scholarships and college applications and everything. This will ruin my life. His panic was genuine and complete, the first time in his privileged existence that he had faced consequences that his parents' money and influence might not be able to fix. Mr. Mitchell, Sarah said quietly, drawing his attention back to her. Your life isn't ruined, but your assumption that you could act without consequences has been corrected. What happens next depends entirely on the choices you make from this point forward. Her words carried a gravity that seemed to age Jake several years in the span of seconds, forcing him to confront the reality that actions had consequences regardless of family wealth or social status. Vice Principal Thompson, who had been largely silent while trying to process the situation, finally spoke up with a question that revealed his own understanding of the school's political dynamics. Miss Chen, given the serious nature of this incident and the potential for significant community reaction, would you be willing to consider resolving this matter through internal disciplinary channels rather than involving external law enforcement? I'm sure we can find a way to address your concerns while minimizing disruption to everyone's academic progress. Sarah's laugh was soft but completely without humor. Mr. Thompson, are you suggesting that I should accept having irreplaceable family artifacts destroyed and being physically assaulted by a student because pursuing appropriate consequences might be disruptive? Are you recommending that I prioritize the comfort of students who have systematically harassed me for weeks over my own right to a safe working environment? Her questions hung in the air like challenges, forcing Thompson to confront the implications of what he was suggesting. The classroom door opened again as 2 additional security officers arrived, followed by Dr. Janet Crawford, the district's director of student services. Crawford was a no-nonsense administrator in her 50s, who had built a reputation for fair but firm handling of complex disciplinary situations. Her presence indicated that the district was taking the incident seriously and intended to conduct a thorough investigation rather than sweeping it under the rug. "I've been briefed on the basic situation. Drive," Crawford announced as she entered the classroom, "and I want everyone to understand that this incident will be investigated fully and impartially. We will review all available evidence, interview all witnesses, and ensure that appropriate consequences are applied regardless of anyone's family connections or social status." Her words were clearly directed toward Principal Hayes and Vice Principal Thompson, both of whom looked uncomfortable under her direct gaze. Derek, realizing that the situation was spiraling completely out of their control, made one final desperate attempt to shift blame back to Sarah. "This is ridiculous. She's a teacher who attacked students. Why is everyone acting like we're the criminals here? Our parents are going to hear about this, and there are going to be some serious consequences for everyone involved." His threat carried less weight than he intended, particularly given that he was now facing potential assault charges himself. Dr. Crawford turned her attention to Derek with the kind of steady gaze that had intimidated countless students over her decades in education. "Mr. Sullivan, your parents will indeed hear about this incident, along with a complete documentation of your behavior over the past several weeks. They will also be informed that their son is facing potential criminal charges for assault and destruction of property, and that his continued enrollment at this school will depend on his willingness to accept responsibility for his actions and make appropriate amends." Marcus, who had been growing increasingly pale as he listened to the escalating consequences, finally broke down completely. "I didn't want to do any of this. Jake and Derek made me. I just wanted them to like me, and they said if I didn't help them mess with the teachers, they wouldn't hang out with me anymore." His confession tumbled out in a rush of tears and panic, revealing the desperate insecurity that had driven him to participate in behavior he clearly knew was wrong. Sarah looked at Marcus with something approaching sympathy, recognizing the familiar dynamic of peer pressure and the desperate need for acceptance that drove many teenage decisions. "Mr. Foster," she said gently, "wanting to be accepted by your peers is normal and understandable. But choosing to hurt other people to gain that acceptance is a line you should never cross. The fact that you recognize this was wrong suggests that you have the capacity to make better choices in the future." Officer Martinez, who had been reviewing some of the video footage on students' phones, looked up with a grim expression. "Based on what I've seen so far, it appears we have clear evidence of assault by Mr. Mitchell, destruction of property by all 3 students, and appropriate self-defense by Ms. Chen. I'll need to complete my investigation, but the preliminary evidence strongly supports Ms. Chen's account of events." Principal Hayes made one last attempt to control the narrative and protect his relationships with influential families. "Officer Martinez, I hope you'll consider the impact that pressing charges might have on these young men's futures. They're good kids from good families who made some poor choices. Surely we can find a way to handle this that doesn't involve criminal records and permanent consequences." The principal's plea for leniency, based on the students' family backgrounds, created a moment of stark clarity about the school's priorities and values. Dr. Crawford's expression hardened as she listened to Hayes essentially argue that wealthy students should face different consequences than others, and several of the witnessing students exchanged looks that suggested they understood exactly what kind of message such differential treatment would send. Sarah stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had finally found her power and intended to use it responsibly. "Principal Hayes, these young men spent 3 weeks systematically harassing me, escalating their behavior each day, while you and your administration turned a blind eye because of their family connections. Today they destroyed irreplaceable family artifacts and physically assaulted me, and your first concern is protecting them from consequences rather than ensuring that justice is served or that other teachers won't face similar treatment." She paused, looking around the room at the students, administrators, and security officers who were hanging on her every word. "I became a teacher because I believe in the power of education to transform lives and help young people become their best selves. But education without accountability is just enabling, and consequences without regard to family wealth or social status is just corruption. These students will learn far more from facing appropriate consequences for their actions than they ever would from being rescued by their parents' influence. Dr. Crawford nodded approvingly at Sarah's statement and turned to address the entire room. This incident will be investigated thoroughly, and consequences will be determined based on evidence and established policies, not family connections or social considerations. Ms. Chen has every right to press charges if she chooses, and the district will support her decision regardless of any pressure from parents or community members. As the immediate crisis began to shift toward official investigation and documentation, Sarah looked around her classroom one final time. The scattered papers had been photographed as evidence, the destroyed family documents carefully collected for potential restoration attempts, and the students who had witnessed everything were preparing to provide statements and video evidence. What had started as a literature class had become a real-world lesson about power, privilege, accountability, and the courage required to stand up for what is right even when facing overwhelming pressure to remain silent. The quiet English teacher who had spent 3 weeks being tested and pushed to her breaking point had finally drawn a line that could not be crossed. The consequences of that decision would ripple through Riverside High School and the surrounding community for months to come, challenging assumptions about authority, privilege, and the price of standing up to those who believe their wealth and influence place them above the rules that govern everyone else. 3 months later, Sarah Chen stood before the Denver Public Schools Board of Directors, receiving a commendation for excellence in teaching and courage under pressure. The investigation had concluded with criminal charges filed against Jake Mitchell for assault, while Derek Sullivan and Marcus Foster received suspended sentences and mandatory community service. More importantly, the incident had sparked a district-wide review of disciplinary policies and anti-harassment protocols that had been long overdue. Principal Hayes had quietly resigned during winter break, citing personal reasons, though everyone understood his departure was connected to his mishandling of the situation and his obvious prioritization of donor relationships over student and teacher safety. Vice Principal Thompson had been reassigned to an administrative role with no student contact after it became clear he had received multiple harassment reports about Jake's crew over 2 years and had taken no meaningful action on any of them. The video footage from that November afternoon had indeed gone viral, but not in the way anyone had expected. Instead of becoming a story about teacher misconduct, it had become a powerful example of what happened when educators finally stood up to entitled behavior and demanded accountability. Sarah had received hundreds of supportive messages from teachers across the country who had faced similar situations but lacked either the training or the institutional support to respond effectively. Jake Mitchell had learned the hardest lesson of his privileged life. His athletic scholarships had been revoked when college recruiters discovered his assault conviction, and his parents had been forced to confront the reality that their money couldn't protect their son from every consequence. The court-mandated anger management classes and community service at a local youth center had slowly begun to teach him empathy and responsibility, though the transformation was still a work in progress. Derek Sullivan had surprised everyone, including himself, by embracing his community service assignment at a literacy center for underprivileged children. Working with kids who had none of his advantages but twice his determination had begun to shift his perspective on privilege and responsibility. His parents, initially outraged by his punishment, had gradually come to appreciate the maturity their son was developing through facing real consequences for his actions. Marcus Foster had perhaps traveled the furthest in his journey toward redemption. The scared 16-year-old who had confessed his role in the harassment had blossomed into a confident young man who now served as a peer counselor, helping other students resist pressure to engage in bullying behavior. His willingness to take responsibility and make amends had impressed the disciplinary committee and had become a model for restorative justice approaches to similar incidents. Sarah's classroom had been transformed as well. The destroyed family documents had been partially restored by a conservation specialist, and the salvaged pieces now formed part of a permanent display about resilience and cultural heritage. Students regularly brought their own family artifacts to share, creating an ongoing dialogue about identity, history, and the stories that shaped their lives. The new principal, Dr. Maria Santos, had implemented sweeping changes to the school's culture and policies. Zero-tolerance harassment policies now applied equally to all students regardless of family connections, and teachers received comprehensive training in recognizing and responding to systematic bullying. Most importantly, The message was clear throughout Riverside High that behavior would be judged by its impact on others, not by the perpetrator's last name or family bank account. Emma Rodriguez, the student who had bravely defended Sarah during the investigation, had gone on to become student body president on a platform of equality and accountability. Her campaign speeches often referenced that November afternoon as a turning point in their school's culture, when one teacher's courage had shown them all what real strength looked like. Sarah continued teaching at Riverside High, but her reputation had fundamentally changed. Students no longer saw her as a pushover or an easy target, but they also didn't fear her. Instead, they respected her as someone who cared enough about education and human dignity to fight for both when necessary. Her classes were among the most requested in the English department, and her waiting lists stretched for semesters in advance. The martial arts training that had once been Sarah's private refuge became a source of inspiration for her teaching philosophy. She began incorporating lessons about discipline, respect, and controlled power into her literature curriculum, helping students understand that true strength came from knowing when to fight and when to choose peace. Master Kim had been immensely proud when Sarah shared the story of her classroom confrontation. "You used exactly enough force to stop the threat and no more," he had told her during their next training session. "That is the mark of a true martial artist and a true teacher. You protected not just yourself, but all the students who will benefit from the lesson you taught that day." The ripple effects of that November afternoon continued to spread throughout the district and beyond. Other teachers began reporting harassment incidents instead of suffering in silence, confident that their administrators would take appropriate action. Parents found themselves having difficult conversations with their children about privilege, respect, and consequences. School board policies were rewritten to ensure that discipline was applied fairly regardless of family influence or financial contributions. Sarah often reflected on the destroyed photographs and documents that had started it all. While the physical artifacts could never be fully restored, their destruction had created something more valuable. A demonstration that some things were worth fighting for, that dignity and respect were not negotiable, and that education meant teaching lessons about character as much as curriculum. The quiet teacher who had chosen gentleness as strength had shown an entire community that sometimes the most important lessons happen when educators refuse to be victims and instead become examples of what courage looks like in action. In the end, Sarah had taught her students far more than literature that day. She had taught them that everyone deserves respect, that actions have consequences, and that real power comes not from what you can take from others, but from what you refuse to let them take from you. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.